Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, a choose your own adventure style investigative session where we will work together to evaluate and make some decisions around browser-based threats. And I'll be your host. My name is Mark Orlando. I'm the field CTO at Push Security. So let's dive in. Just to give you a little bit of background on what we're going to be going over today and some of the things that we're going to talk about, I'm going to start off by giving a brief introduction to browser-based threats and why, even with all of the great evolution of security technology and detection and response capabilities over the last few decades, we still have quite an enormous blind spot when it comes to identity-based attacks and other threats that materialize in the browser. So using some demonstrative examples today, we're going to walk through what some of those threats look like, how they work, make some decisions about how best to investigate and respond to those threats when we happen to come across them. And we're going to highlight some of the gaps that even very sophisticated defensive technology stacks leave when it comes to responding to those types of attacks. Now, first, I want to give a little bit of a history lesson, or maybe a refresher for some of you, where we started off several years ago with this group, Lapsus, that evolved into Scattered Spider and then ShinyHunters, and what's today referred to kind of jokingly somewhat as Scattered Lapsus Hunters, a name that the group in fact gave to themselves. And we sometimes refer to this evolving group as the COM. And I pause when I say group because it's really more of a just loosely affiliated set of adversaries that sometimes coordinate, sometimes don't, sometimes reuse a lot of the same tools and techniques, but are characterized by the fact that they are on the younger side, predominantly English-speaking hackers that are focused on extortion and social engineering attacks. And we've seen over the last several years, as our researchers at Push have tracked this group, that they're behind some of the biggest, high-profile, most damaging breaches that we've seen in the last several years. Breaches like the Okta breach and Cyberhaven, Jaguar Land Rover, the M&S and Co-op breaches, Salesforce, and the list goes on and on and on. And what we've seen throughout the evolution of this group is really an evolution of their tactics and techniques. And it seems that they have kind of refined their approaches and done a pretty remarkable job of changing up their techniques and doing different things in order to evade detection and make it very difficult not only to block the kinds of attacks that they're launching, but even to detect these types of attacks. And if you look at some of the company names and organizations in this list, you might surmise that many of these organizations have substantial security budgets, have probably invested in a lot of defensive capabilities. So I think this is a really good picture of what the problem space is in which we're operating. So the key here is that we're looking at some new tactics, new techniques that are specifically designed to evade traditional security controls like endpoint detection and response, or secure web gateways, or email security tools. And when we are bypassing those tools, well, then it falls to us as defenders to come up with new and creative ways to meet the attackers where they're operating. In this case, that is largely in the browser, and devise new methods of detection and response. Now, in this new era, and I'll elaborate on what I mean by the new era in a minute, we've got these existing traditional defenses like EDR, which are not invalidated by identity-based attacks or attacks in the browser, but they leave much to be desired when it comes to visibility into what's happening in the browser and the ability to effect change proactively, right? Meaning to stop these attacks from completing. So that's the challenge that we're facing. And again, looking back a few years, in this case several years, you can think about the evolution of attacks and the evolution of our defenses in terms of three eras. Now, this is a broad generalization, but by and large, in the 2000s and even a few years prior to that, defenders are very focused on this idea of defending the perimeter, right? Very network centric, looking at network centric attack activity, very concerned about our internet facing footprint, systems and services exposed to the internet. Okay, so we bulked up our defenses, focused on deploying firewalls and web proxies and other kind of mitigating controls to harden that perimeter defense. Moving into the 2010s, we're in more of the endpoint era now. So we did a fairly decent job of driving up attacker cost for going directly through the perimeter, through those perimeter defenses. So attackers shifted their focus to landing on the endpoints through social engineering, through targeting users directly, and through doing some pretty sophisticated things to live off the land and try to avoid installing additional tools or running commands that would run afoul of other endpoint-based security controls. So in this endpoint era, that really gave rise to EDR and some of the more sophisticated endpoint controls that we have today. And now moving into present day, into the 2020s, we've entered the identity era. So we've done a pretty good job of imposing cost at the network perimeter, such as there is one anymore, at the endpoint, certainly. And so now attackers have started to shift their focus into focusing on identity and taking advantage of this sprawling infrastructure that can be found in many modern organizations where we've got SaaS and different apps and cloud infrastructure. So we're looking at attacks like account takeover, token theft, OAuth app abuse, things like that. Okay? So if we think about where we are today, we've moved from the network era to the endpoint era to the identity era. Now, those of us who do security operations or detection response or security analysis, hopefully by this point you're well aware of bias, right? Bias is formed through the sum total of your experiences and incidents you've worked and threats you're familiar with. And if we think back to these different eras, especially for some of us who have lived through all of these eras, it can be difficult to unanchor yourself from this endpoint-centric way of thinking, right? And the risk there is that we think, well, because I have EDR, because I have, let's say, multi-factor authentication, because I have other security controls for cloud access like CASB, well, this list of things should disrupt 99% of the attacks I'm going to see. And everything else, I'm collecting all of the network data and the endpoint data I need. That's all going into a SIM. And so, by and large, I'm still in a good position to detect even sophisticated in-browser threats, but it just isn't so. So we have to disabuse ourselves from this mindset that sticking to this network-centric thinking or this endpoint-oriented thinking is going to be sufficient to meet attackers in this new era. And if you kind of dig into that a little bit more, some of the mental models that we've built about what attacks look like also need to be updated. So whereas we might have thought about, the perimeter and defending against threats in our environment, well, what even is our environment anymore? Really, it looks more like this. We may have some on-prem systems, we may have user systems, but we also have a number of different third-party sites, services, SaaS infrastructure that may have sensitive data, handle some of our authentication and identity management. But this is, again, a sprawling ecosystem that really doesn't align to some of the more traditional ways of thinking about attacks. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But exacerbating this problem is that users now not only have their primary corporate IDP account, Microsoft, Google, Okta, but they've got several identities, several accounts that they're using across could be hundreds of different apps. So this has a compounding effect on our attack surface where identity is concerned. So previously, as a defender, if I was trying to build out a detection and response capability, I might do that using this mental model of the kill chain or the attack chain, where sophisticated multi-stage attacks give me lots of opportunities to identify and respond to that attack at different kind of phases of that attack. But in today's world, in SaaS infrastructure for these in-browser threats that we're going to look at during this webinar, the kill chain, the attack chain has been compressed significantly. so that once an attacker gains initial access, if they can take over your account, if they can gain access to an authenticated session, if they can gain that trust, they can move directly into data collection, exfiltration, actions on objectives. So our time window to identify and respond to these things has shrunk substantially. With all that said, let's jump right into choosing our own paths in investigating some of these types of threats. So my goal for this session is for you to take away three different things. First, I want you to have a better understanding of what some of these modern in-browser threats look like, how they're likely to materialize in your environment. I want to walk through some of the detection and response challenges. Hopefully we'll work through some of those together. And I want to highlight that gap that I mentioned up front, which is in-browser visibility and in-browser mitigating controls, so that we understand the necessity of expanding that security stack to include browser-based detection and response. So here we go, folks. We're under attack. In this event, your votes will decide what our investigative priorities are for each of the three attack scenarios that I'm going to present to you. Now, again, my goal here is to highlight some of the challenges of detection and response in these various scenarios. And you'll notice that we've taken some liberties with our evidence, with some of the guardrails that we've put in place for these investigations, just in the interest of time. You may find that you would take some of these investigations much further. Maybe you would conduct some additional forensic analysis before making any decisions. But the bottom line here is that time and resources are both finite quantities, finite resources here, right? So we need to be able to make decisions quickly. We need to be able to respond to threats and contain them and recover quickly. And we want to try to do that in an evidence-based manner where we're causing minimal disruption to business processes or to users. So let's move forward here with our first scenario, legal troubles. Here's the situation. We've received a report from user Alice in legal operations, who reports that her laptop is acting strangely while doing some research on case law. She visited a website she had never gone to before called legallegal.org, and she followed some on-screen instructions to, quote, update an extension. Now, she insists that she didn't download any files, didn't do anything, in response to some of the unusual behavior she observed, but there was a pop-up. Her browser froze for a few seconds. She couldn't do anything else. And she claims that she clicked out of everything, closed the window, continued working, and everything seemed fine. She was able to grab a screenshot of this activity. You can see here the website, legallegal.org, and there's an unusual pop-up here, extension update required, which seems highly shady, highly suspicious. So now the question becomes, what are our triage priorities? So here's where I want you to vote on what investigative questions we should focus on first. While you're considering that, a few notes on how to run investigations. What we don't want to do is take a very limited piece of information, limited insight into what's happening, which in this case is a user report and a screenshot, and dive right into the data and dive right into containment. Instead, we want to first consider what our investigative questions are. Right? What do we really need to know here? Then we need to consider what data might contain the answers to those questions, right? And where that data is located. And then once we review that information, that evidence, then we can make a determination around what that means and where the investigation and response should go. So with all that in mind, what are your votes on triage priorities? Do we need to know if the site is malicious? Did any commands execute locally? Is there any risk of credential theft or compromise or lateral movement? Is this issue isolated to Alice only? Is it potentially more widespread than that? Based on your votes, it looks like option B is the most pressing question here. Did any commands execute locally? Now, if you're looking at this scenario and the evidence presented and thinking, oh, this kind of seems like a ClickFix-style or perhaps drive-by style attack, I think that would be a reasonable hypothesis. So with that in mind, what we want to do first is see if the command actually executed. So let's assume we've thought through that and maybe examined some more data here. The pop-up, the screenshot, certainly suspicious, but what we don't know are any process names for processes that may have spawned, any PowerShell or other commands that were run on Alice's machine. And remember, the clock is ticking. If this was a successful attack, then we may already have malware running. We may already have a compromise that has already taken place. So we need to act fast. So let's see what we're going to do next. In order to understand if any commands ran locally, what is the most appropriate data source for that? Where would we get answers to those questions? If you voted on checking the email security gateway to see if any malicious files were delivered, well, I'm sorry to say that there's nothing there. This wasn't a phishing email. The attack originated inside the browser via most likely organic web browsing. So that's maybe not the best vote, right? So what we want to do before we move into containment is think about maybe what happened on Alice's PC. Remember, we want to know if any commands were run. So we might go to EDR alerts, and here's what we find. We see that explorer.exe has spawned command.exe, nothing unusual about that. And it does look like some PowerShell executed around the time that Alice visited the website in question. Furthermore, if we look at the command line, the PowerShell command itself, we can see that it's an encoded command, some base64 encoded strings there. So could it be possible that she actually clicked through? Well, maybe. There's no indication that she did. Certainly, we have another useful bit of evidence here, which is that some PowerShell looks like ran around the same time. So we're at a critical juncture in our investigation here. Still pretty early on, but we've gotten some more insight into what's going on. Do we want to execute containment or not? So consider this. Isolating the endpoint is going to disrupt Alice's work. Right? Resetting her credentials will also be a disruption. Blocking the domain may help us address this particular threat, but if you're looking at option C and thinking, well, that doesn't help with any compromise that may have occurred, you would be correct. Or we could just choose to monitor only. It looks like the most popular answer here, most popular selection based on your vote is to isolate the endpoint. So let's take a look at what happens there. We take the device off the network. Again, Alice is temporarily blocked from continuing her work while we provision her a new workstation. On the plus side, there are no additional alerts, no unusual activity in the wake of this action. So let's kind of continue. Remember, correlation is not causation. So was there some PowerShell that was run around the same time? Yes. Could there be plenty of other perfectly legitimate explanations for why you would see base64 encoded PowerShell? 100%. This is actually quite common in administrative scripts and some other administrative use cases where you would see that sort of thing. And what we don't want to do is tie those things together without evidence. So if you acted solely based on that PowerShell without doing any additional analysis or without trying to tie those together, then you may have disrupted Alice's workflow here without any reason for doing that. So we want to make sure we understand what actually happened before we choose containment. And if you said to yourself, well, I would have done some additional analysis on that PowerShell, maybe decoded that base64 encoded string, that was the right answer. Because in this case, we're going to presume that that was actually fine, maybe not related to what has gone on. Okay. Now, we have taken action, certainly, acted decisively, but maybe been a little bit more disruptive than we needed to have been. So let's talk about how this would have gone if we had some browser telemetry. Before we get into that, let's talk through some mechanics of what a ClickFix-style attack looks like. The idea here is that the attacker is trying to prompt the user to take some action, usually to solve a problem or to complete some transaction, which normally includes a copy and paste. Effectively, they're trying to get the user to paste in a command that allows the attacker to then continue that attack chain, right? Tricking the user into doing the attacker's work for them. That copy action happens inside the browser. It can either be performed manually by the user or automatically by some other page interaction. Attackers in these types of attacks are increasingly using all kinds of sophisticated validation and defense evasion to make it so that if you're looking at network traffic only or endpoint activity or identity activity, it's going to be very difficult for you to identify that something strange is going on. Most likely, it's going to look like the victim is going through multiple legitimate domains and sites, sites.google.com or Microsoft Dynamics or some other legitimate service that's been abused. So really sophisticated things happen that are very difficult to detect once a user interacts with and completes that kind of click, fix, copy, and paste. So what can we do about that? Well, if we have visibility and control inside the browser, right, which is the case with push security, which deploys as a browser extension, you can monitor for things like copy actions, and you can look inside the contents of that copy action and identify any suspicious or malicious payloads there. Now, what you're seeing here is a mocked up screenshot of the push security interface where we have identified a malicious copy and paste detected. Now, in this case, as you can see in the screenshot, we've been somewhat permissive with our control here. We have alerted on it, but not blocked it. But optionally, we could just switch this into blocking mode, and that pretty much takes care of the entire rest of the attack chain in this case, right? Malicious copy and paste detected. If it's in blocking mode, that threat is mitigated immediately, and everything we've just talked through over the last several minutes is unnecessary because we have disrupted the attack in real time. Don't need to take her machine offline. There's nothing here that's of real concern because not only have we mitigated the attack, but we've got visibility here in what was previously a blind spot where we can understand exactly what happened. So wrapping up, remember, attacks don't always execute end to end. In this case, either because Alice closed the window or maybe she didn't pass all the validation mechanisms if she did actually click through. But it looks like the attack did not complete. However, in the absence of evidence or absence of data, we had to take action to take her machine offline, and that was certainly the right choice. However, we've also disrupted some business processes, taken a user offline without that hard evidence, which again is what we want to avoid and can avoid if we have that visibility and control in the browser. So let's talk about our second scenario. Looks legit to me. Here's the trigger. We receive an alert, let's say through a SIM correlation rule, where a user, Bob, in finance, has successfully authenticated and completed an MFA process, multi-factor authentication process, from a brand new device. Minutes later, we see another alert for a new auto-forwarding rule in Bob's mailbox to send out any messages with the string invoice in the subject to some unknown outside email address. A previously unseen OAuth consent is also granted to a new app that we've seen called Productivity app, really generic, kind of strange sounding. We reach out to Bob. He says, I didn't really see anything unusual. I logged in, I got an MFA prompt, and I approved it. And it looked like the Microsoft page. Wasn't anything weird. I completed the process, seemed fine to me. And by the way, here's a screenshot from Bob showing that pop-up, that prompt to complete his multi-factor authentication. Now I want to pause here and ask you, what do you see as being unusual about this login? The page contents look pretty legit, but if you look a little closer, you can see some, let's say, irregularities. First off, the domain is not the legitimate Microsoft domain, but Microsoft can be, a little bit complicated with how they do redirects and do different domains. Let's say, well, this looks close enough to the average user. But we can also see, looking a little closer, in this multi-factor authentication pop-up, authenticator is misspelled. There's some weird things happening here, which a normal user like Bob, who's focusing on just doing his job, might not recognize. So again, let's decide what our triage priorities should be, and I'll leave this to you. Do we need to know how we got to the site? Do we need to know if his account is compromised? Do we need to start getting into post-exploitation scoping? Let's assume that the attacker now has access to Bob's account. Or do we need to do some kind of retrospective analysis, figure out why MFA didn't stop this? If you answered, is Bob's account compromised? I think that's the best triage priority here. Validate the authentication integrity, validate the account integrity. Now we know that successful MFA occurred and was completed. No failed logins were reported or showing up in our data. No evidence that the MFA process itself was attacked through MFA fatigue, push bombing, things like that. So now, here's what we know. Authentication succeeded. There are some mailbox changes that occurred post-login. There's an unusual OAuth app here. No other obvious authentication failures. The entry point for the attacker remains unclear. So at this point, where should we take the investigation? What data gives us additional evidence and insight into what may be happening with Bob, with his machine, right? We can check the email security gateway, which shows us that it doesn't look like Bob received any phishing emails, at least based on SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Now, here's a bonus question. If you're familiar with sender policy framework or domain keys identified mail and these kinds of checks, is it possible that a message could pass these checks and still be illegitimate? If you answered yes, you're correct. These are simply spam, anti-spoofing type checks. They say nothing about the contents of a message. So it's entirely possible that absent any other detail, any of these messages could still be malicious. But it doesn't look like anything weird is going on here at first glance. I should also point out that this is not very high diagnosticity evidence in the sense that phishing is now an omni-channel problem. It doesn't only come through email. In fact, based on our research at Push, as much as potentially half of phishing comes through other channels like social media, through a LinkedIn message, through malicious advertisements, through in-app notifications and other abused services. So this really doesn't tell us too much. Let's go to the next option. Do we want to pivot our investigation and gather more information, or do we want to move into containment? If you answered that we don't really have enough that we want to contain yet, you learned your lesson from the last scenario, we want to learn a little bit more about what's going on, then that is correct. So do we want to investigate MFA attacks? Do we want to review IDP sign-in logs? Do we want to pull endpoint telemetry? Let's say we want to review IDP activity. Well, we know that there was a login from an unfamiliar source, but otherwise, the login was marked as compliant. Nothing unusual. So what does that mean? Well, most likely what's happening here is an attacker has done what we often refer to as an adversary in the middle or attacker in the middle phishing attack, where effectively they have proxied Bob's authentication process, where that screenshot that we saw was actually a phishing site and probably some kind of phish kit or tool behind that site, which was taking Bob's inputs, proxying that or passing that through to the legitimate Microsoft site, and in doing so, able to grab not only his credentials, but his authenticated session and bypass or at least get around his MFA control here, right? So what do we want to do to contain this? Do we want to reset his password? Do we want to revoke the session tokens? Do we want to block the sender or the domain in question? Or do we want to just kind of hang back and monitor, see if anything else goes wrong? Well, we certainly don't want to do nothing. The problem with a password reset is that if what we're looking at here is an attacker in the middle style phishing attack, most likely the attacker has access to authenticated sessions. We've got this weird OAuth app. There is plenty here for an attacker to work with from a persistence perspective. They have most likely successfully established persistence. So we can reset Bob's password, but the attacker most likely will still have access. So the best option here is revoking tokens and authenticated sessions, right? Including invalidating that OAuth app, removing that until we can determine whether that is allowed or not. So this is better than a password reset, but here's what we still don't know: how Bob got to this site, how access was obtained, whether the attacker has some other means of persistence. Okay, we're familiar with this OAuth app now that we've identified it, but have there been other changes made aside from this malicious email rule that was put in? So we were just the underlying root causes here, but maybe haven't cleaned up the attack 100%. So every control we had in this case more or less did its job. MFA kicked in, Bob completed the MFA, so we know that that was working more or less as it should. We had EDR running, we were watching email, right? All these controls were in place. But still, because of what happened in the browser context, fortunately, we saw and we're paying close attention to that IDP telemetry, and we picked up that something was unusual. But without that in-browser visibility, we can't detect or effectively mitigate this kind of threat. So the majority of these kinds of phishing attacks, again, are executed using these phish kits or other tools, things like EvilJinx, that are acting as that proxy to the legitimate IDP, right? So they sit between the target and the legitimate login portal in order to grab that sensitive credential and session data. That's what most likely happened here. Now, if we're sitting inside the browser as a secure agent, a browser detection and response agent, if you will, we can not only identify that this is happening, but we can put a stop to it before that process is complete. So again, effectively stopping the attack in its tracks. Here's how this works in push security. We've identified a series of markers, things like URL, page behaviors, the DOM structure, which is kind of the blueprint of the website, things that tell us, hey, this looks really similar to what EvilJinx looks like, or what some of the other phish kits look like. We can also tell if this page is in fact the legitimate Microsoft login page, or if there are some differences that tell us, hey, this looks like the login page, but it's really not Microsoft. Once we've identified that, we can step in and stop Bob and any other user from entering their IDP or their SSO credentials into any site that is not legitimately, in this case, Microsoft.com. So we have a few different controls there to prevent this kind of thing from completing successfully. But unless you're in the browser, able to analyze JavaScript and DOM and password fields and user interactions, you won't have all of the key indicators that you need to make this determination and intervene in real time. So wrapping up here, in this case, MFA was not bypassed, it was not attacked, it was completed by Bob in parallel. Browser session, authentication material, that is where the compromise occurred. And the attacker moved very quickly, established persistence in the form of that OAuth app, had set up that email forwarding rule as a means of data exfiltration, right? So as we talked about at the top of the hour here, the attack chain is dramatically compressed. We're more or less playing cleanup here. And if we had those phishing controls and those mitigating controls in the browser, we might have stopped this attack before really it even got started. Now, let's take a look at our third and final scenario, web app weirdness. Here's the user report. Carol in procurement reports that some internal apps, web apps, are acting weird. Pages loading slower, and importantly, sometimes she's just getting logged out. Her sessions are getting killed randomly. She logs out, back in, restarted her PC several times, no change. Well, kudos to Carol for trying the turn it off and turn it back on again, but most likely we have some kind of larger issue here. So time to vote. What question matters the most right now? Right? You can think about this in order of most important to least important. Are the sessions being invalidated across multiple apps for Carol, or is this a problem isolated to a single app? Is it affecting other users? Did anything change recently on Carol's device or with her account? And are we seeing any authentication failures? Right? And given these questions, frankly, all of which are somewhat important, where should we go for this data? We can check the IDP logs. We can look at conditional access policy changes. We can look at token settings for session timeout and things like that. Now, again, this one's a little trickier because all of these might be things that we would check in the course of our troubleshooting. But let's take a look at sign-in logs. We don't see anything unusual here, only successful completed authentications. Because remember, to the IDP, it's not really concerned about where the requests are coming from or some of the other attack vectors that we've talked about. All it cares about, more or less, is that Carol has successfully completed the login and MFA process, and that's what we're seeing here. So not too much to go on. So IDP service health is green. Authentication logs are clean. No other users have reported issues, but this is happening across the board only for Carol. So what do? Do we pass the issue back on to IT? Say, sorry folks, it's your problem. Or do we dig a little bit deeper? And of course, if you said dig a little bit deeper, that is correct. We don't want to just hand it off. We want to try to solve the problem, figure out what's going on here. So here's the evidence at hand. Sessions terminate inconsistently, but specific to Carol. It's happening across different apps. No clear authentication failures, no endpoint alerts, no network instability that we can perceive. So now we want to think about what's happening in the browser. Has anything changed recently? Have you installed anything? Any extensions or add-ons or done anything that might explain this anomaly? And in this case, most signs point back to the user, probably going to be the quickest way we can get some of these answers. So let's say we get back with Carol. And she says, you know what, now that you mention it, I did install a browser extension last week to help me compare vendor prices. Procurement Helper, it's called. But I installed it from the browser app store. Didn't get any warnings. Didn't see any issues until a few days later. Do you think maybe this could be related? Well, yes, Carol, I think it could be related. And if that's what you were thinking, then we're on the same page. So let's take a look at how we would scope and contain something like this. So we have this highly suspicious browser extension. It's got around 1,000, 1,100 installs globally. If you go take a look at its listing on the extension store, the browser store. So unlikely that this is a pervasive issue across our customer base. So do we only want to uninstall it for Carol's machine? Do we want to force password resets? Do we want to block the extension store listing? Do we want to do a hunt? I think the most appropriate action here and the most kind of surgical action is to simply uninstall it from Carol's PC. So we do that. Unfortunately, the extension soon reinstalls via some sync policy on another of Carol's browser profiles. So it seems like we have an issue here. There's a little bit of persistence happening that's baked into kind of the browser profiles and the extension here. Okay. And what's worse is we don't really know, other than what we can find out about the extension, what it has done, why it's suddenly causing these issues. So if we want to really and permanently get rid of this threat, we can either disable the extension for all machines, or take a number of other actions here. Or do we do all of these things? Really make sure that the extension is gone. I think the most appropriate answer here is D, all of the above. Now, determining what makes a browser extension malicious versus not malicious, there are some clear indicators of a malicious extension, but there are also some anomalous behaviors that may or may not be malicious. So establishing, kind of data exfil, through communication channel out to another website or domain, doing like CSP downgrades, trying to change the content security policy on a site. These are pretty clear red flags, but injecting JavaScript into internal apps, clipboard monitoring, cookie access, these are suspicious, anomalous, may or may not indicate this is a bad extension. So again, with push security, you are in a position to do more comprehensive extension enumeration in the browser. So it's not necessarily about, is this good or bad, but it's about how was the browser installed? Was it installed manually by the user, side-loaded by an app? pulled down out of the legitimate kind of web app store. And for each extension, what permissions does it require? Has it requested? Right? How many of your users are using this extension? So we have a one-stop shop because we're sitting right there in the browser where you can get answers to all of these questions without having to act on supposition, assumptions, inference. So remember, just because an extension exists in the browser app store, it doesn't mean it's automatically trustworthy. We see all the time extensions that were previously legitimate and are now malicious, either because they changed ownership, which is fairly common. An adversary will reach out to a 1 or 2 person development team who maintains an extension and say, hey, I'll pay you this much money now that I've seen your extension has a pretty broad install base, and why don't you just let me take over management of this project? And then, of course, they introduce malicious capabilities. We've also seen supply chain attacks like what we saw with Cyberhaven, where attackers will find other ways to compromise developers or other engineering personnel in order to introduce those capabilities. So very, very difficult to flag these things, even if they're in an approved app store. In this case, there's not necessarily going to be any malware, any exploitation that's happening, any EDR alerts, because this is just an extension doing extension things inside of the browser. But unfortunately, extension things is a pretty long list. Right? So in this case, the browser, if you think about it as a control plane or the new operating system, the extension is an app in that operating system, right? And now it becomes an incident response problem in the browser. So in conclusion, we've gone through just a few very high-level scenarios here. Some of the visibility gaps we talked about in the browser make detection and response for these in-browser threats extremely difficult. And you aren't going to be able to rely on EDR, mail logs, IDP logs, or network traffic, or potentially other controls to fill in that gap. The only way to do that is by being in the browser itself, where you can act on evidence, you can intervene in real time versus making assumptions, or even worse, having false negatives where a threat is materializing and you're missing it entirely. That brings us to the end of our webinar. I want to thank you all very much for attending and leave you with some resources here. We have a very skilled applied research team who's digging into these threats constantly, and we do our best to publish that research, which you can find on our blog. If you want to learn more about Push Security's capabilities, how we do what we do, what that looks like, you can get a demo by going to pushsecurity.com/demo. Thanks very much. Have a great day.